12,000 years ago, at the very edge of the Ice Age, there may have been people walking the Earth who didn't fit any chapter of human evolution we've written so far. Taller, heavier, built on a scale that makes every bone they left behind a quiet argument with the standard story. And if the evidence is pointing where some researchers believe it's pointing, they were still alive when the first human civilizations were just beginning to scratch at the soil elsewhere on the planet. The pyramids at Giza are only 4,500 years old. Agriculture goes back maybe 10,000 years. Whatever these beings were, they may have been walking an island while farmers in the Fertile Crescent were still figuring out wheat. That's not ancient history in any geological sense. That is practically yesterday, and it changes everything about how uncomfortable the question becomes. The story sits in genuinely difficult territory for mainstream science, not the territory of conspiracy theories and suppressed discoveries, but the territory of real physical evidence that doesn't yet have a clean explanation attached to it. Fossils that fall outside expected size ranges, archaeological traces that suggest sustained occupation, repeated behavior, a group of beings who knew how to live in this place across generations, oral traditions from communities who have lived on and near this island for thousands of years, traditions that keep describing the same thing across generations with a consistency that is hard to dismiss outright, and a scientific community that is actively, sometimes bitterly divided about what any of it means. That division is not a sign the question is frivolous. It is a sign the question is real. To even begin thinking clearly about this, you have to be precise about the word giant, because that word carries an enormous amount of baggage that has nothing to do with evolutionary biology. In biological terms, when researchers speak of a giant human species, they are not talking about pathological gigantism, the condition caused by a pituitary tumor that can push a single individual to 8 or 9 feet while destroying their joints, weakening their heart, and nearly always preventing reproduction. Pathological gigantism does not produce a species. It produces individuals in pain who leave no descendants. What matters here is something entirely different, a population-level adaptation to large body size, a situation where natural selection across many generations has pushed an entire group towards significantly greater height and mass as a survival strategy. That is a real biological phenomenon with real biological mechanisms, and it would leave a very different kind of archaeological record than a disease. When a whole population is large, the skeleton rewrites itself. Joints that function without complaint, at average human proportions, face different mechanical demands at greater height and mass. Bone density increases. The architecture of the hip and knee changes. Gait patterns shift because a longer stride requires different musculature and a different center of gravity. The energetic cost of maintaining more body mass rises. And in warm climates, where large bodies struggle to shed heat, all of this creates a puzzle. What selection pressure would drive size upward despite the metabolic and thermal expense? That question is not a reason to dismiss the claim. It is a reason to dig harder, because if size was being selected for anyway, something in that island environment was making it worth the cost. What the scientists looking at this most seriously are after is not a single dramatic specimen. They are after a consistent anatomical pattern across multiple individuals, proportions that hold together as a coherent body plan, features that cannot be explained by individual variation, disease, or unusual nutrition acting on one person. They want an archaeological context to go with the bones, fire management, food remains, tool use, signs of a reproducing community living in a place through time. And they need that pattern to be distinct enough from known populations that it cannot be folded into existing categories without distorting those categories beyond recognition. That bar is high. It should be. The history of paleoanthropology is full of what happens when the bar gets lowered. Piltdown Man was a deliberate hoax assembled from a modern human skull and an orangutan jaw that fooled the field for 4 decades because people wanted the evidence to confirm what they already suspected. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that principle has not gone out of style. Most of what circulates as giant human evidence online fails that standard immediately, for 3 recurring reasons. First, mismeasured bones. Fragmentary fossils are notoriously difficult to scale correctly, and small methodological choices in which regression formula you use and which reference population you compare against can produce wildly different height estimates that then get quoted in media without any of the uncertainty attached. Second, mixed deposits. Caves and rock shelters accumulate material across enormous spans of time, and bones from different periods, different individuals, sometimes different species entirely, end up in the same sediment layer through the movement of soil by roots, animals, and water. Third, sensational reporting. The gap between what a paper actually claims and what a headline declares can be enormous, and conditional language erodes rapidly with each retelling until the careful version never goes viral and the reckless version lives forever. The specific reason this island story cannot be dismissed with those general criticisms is that islands do something to evolution that continental landscapes simply do not. Isolation changes everything. When sea levels rise and cut a landmass loose from its neighbors, whatever was living there gets trapped. No gene flow in, no gene flow out. From that moment, evolution stops taking its usual slow continental pace and starts doing something concentrated and strange. The same forces that drove the Galapagos finches to diverge into a dozen species, the same logic that produced the Komodo dragon and the pygmy mammoth and the dodo, those forces apply to humans too, because humans are animals subject to the same selection pressures and genetic drift as everything else. Islands produce both island dwarfism and island gigantism, working in opposite directions depending on the available resources and the presence or absence of predators. Island dwarfism happens when large-bodied animals are isolated on a small island with limited food. The individuals that survive on less reproduce more, and over generations the population shrinks. This is how you get dwarf elephants, dwarf hippos, and the miniature humans of Flores, Indonesia. Island gigantism runs the opposite logic. Small-bodied animals on an island with abundant resources and no significant predators can afford to grow. Being bigger helps them compete for food, succeed reproductively, and regulate body temperature. When nothing is hunting you and calories are relatively available, size stops being a liability and starts being an advantage. Giant tortoises, giant rats, flightless birds that abandon the energy cost of flight entirely because the ground was safe, all products of the same logic. And crucially, none of this is speculative biology. The mechanisms are well understood, and the precedents across species are extensive. Then there is the matter of sea levels, which changes the entire shape of the story. Sea levels have not been constant across the last 1,000,000 years. During glacial maxima, when enormous volumes of water were locked in continental ice sheets, global sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today. Vast stretches of continental shelf that are now seafloor were dry land. Islands that are isolated today were connected to the mainland during those cold periods, and when the ice retreated and sea levels rose, those connections flooded. Whatever was living on the newly isolated land masses found itself cut off, sometimes gradually, sometimes with startling speed across the span of a few generations. A population might colonize an island during a low sea level period when it was accessible, then get stranded when the seas rose, then potentially reconnect during the next glacial cycle, then get isolated again. Each cycle adds another chapter to the evolutionary divergent story. Lineages that survive long enough, through enough of these cycles, can end up looking very different from anything on the mainland. Which brings the discussion to relic populations. When a species goes extinct on a continent, it usually goes extinct everywhere because the same pressures operate across large connected areas. But islands can be refugia, protected pockets where a lineage that has vanished from the wider world manages to hang on, sometimes for astonishing lengths of time, simply because the pressures that killed it everywhere else never arrived. The coelacanth was considered extinct for 65 million years before one turned up in a South African fish market in 1938. The tuatara of New Zealand is a living representative of a reptile lineage that disappeared from the rest of the world 200 million years ago. Late survival in isolation is not extraordinary in principle. What makes any particular case extraordinary is the species involved, the time scale, and what the bones and sediments and tools actually show. At roughly 12,000 years ago, the world was in the process of a dramatic transformation. The last ice age was dying. Ice sheets that had sat over North America and northern Eurasia for tens of thousands of years were melting, dumping absurd volumes of fresh water into the oceans. Coastlines were not shifting politely. They were lurching. Many of the islands we know today were not yet islands. They were the high ground of broad continental shelves, separated from the mainland not by deep water, but by river valleys and low plains that were being drowned as sea levels climbed. So when someone says a strange, possibly giant human survived on an island until 12,000 years ago, the first question has to be what the word island even meant at that point. Because the answer is that it meant a shrinking landscape, a piece of high ground being steadily surrounded as the world warmed. People living at those edges were being compressed upward. Rivers flooded. Coastal resources reorganized. The communities that survived were the ones that tracked those resources as they moved, or learned to exploit the elongating shoreline itself, which meant more fishing, more use of whatever vessels would carry them across channels that had once been dry land. By 12,000 years ago, humans across much of the planet were extremely capable at exactly this kind of adaptation. These were not primitive caricatures. They had specialized stone tools, complex hunting strategies, fire management, and in many places, early forms of food storage. They knew their landscapes intimately, understood seasonal cycles and animal behavior, and moved across them with purpose. Placing a hypothetical relic population in this world is not placing it in prehistory's dark ages. It is placing it in a world of capable, resourceful people who were already navigating one of the most dramatic environmental transitions in human experience. The bones that started this conversation came to light the way significant archaeological discoveries almost always do, gradually, unevenly, and mostly as accidents. Farmers deepening wells, quarry crews splitting rock, local people who knew for generations that certain limestone ridges yielded strange things if you dug into them, old men's stories about skulls in particular caves, passed around in villages long before any academic with credentials arrived to investigate. These early reports carry all the problems that early reports always carry. Measurements were hasty or not taken at all. Provenance, the exact location, depth, and surrounding sediment of each find was recorded in language too vague to be scientifically useful. Objects were left, trampled, or quietly pocketed before documentation could happen. When formal attention finally arrived, the early investigators brought with them the assumption frameworks of their own time, looking at physical features through lenses built for different purposes and asking leading questions rather than open ones. By the time those initial accounts entered print, conditional language had already begun to erode. Appears larger became is larger, may indicate became proves. The careful version got abandoned and the dramatic version went into circulation, where it was quoted and requoted until it acquired the false solidity of repeated citation. Once bones are actually on a table under proper light, the analytical work begins, and it is less glamorous than the headlines suggest. The femur, the thigh bone, is the single best predictor of overall height in modern humans. Its length, combined with regression formulas built on thousands of measured skeletons, allows reasonable stature estimates. But those formulas come with caveats that rarely survive media coverage. If you only have a partial femoral shaft without the ends, you have to reconstruct the missing portions in your head, and what you choose to imagine will drive your conclusion. If you assume proportions like those of an average modern person, you might generate estimates of 7 or 8 feet. If the bone actually came from a stocky individual with relatively short femora for their body size, as many archaic humans had, those numbers shrink dramatically when you plug realistic proportions into the equation. Sexual dimorphism creates further confusion. In many human groups, males are significantly more robust than females, and the tallest males in a population can look extraordinary compared to a modern urban reference sample, even when they are entirely within the range of human biology. Population variation magnifies this further. Well-fed, physically active hunter-gatherers from protein-rich environments can have bones that look massive compared to 19th century European city dwellers, which were the reference samples used in many early analyses. Then there is robustness, which is not the same as height. Thick cortical walls, heavy shafts, strongly developed muscle attachment sites, large joint surfaces. These are the marks of bodies that did hard physical work. They do not automatically belong to bodies that are exceptionally tall. A femur can be short and stout. A humerus can be average in length, but built like a crowbar. Without a proper comparative collection, shelves of skeletons from known populations, ages and sexes, it is incredibly easy to misread heavily built as giant. Modern methods have begun to claw back some clarity from the archival confusion. Digital morphometrics, three-dimensional scanning, and landmark analysis allow researchers to capture the geometry of bones with a precision no ruler can match. You can then overlay those digital models onto datasets from modern humans, Neanderthals, Homo erectus, island hominins, and populations from across the height spectrum. Sometimes this is deflationary, a famous oversized skull that was long touted as evidence of a giant sits comfortably within known human variation when properly scanned. Sometimes it works the other way, revealing subtle, non-modern features in a bone that early workers had filed as just another unusually large individual. Dating the evidence is where many spectacular claims dissolve. Radiocarbon works on anything that was once alive within roughly the last 50,000 years. Bone, charcoal, wood, seeds. But it has traps that are rarely explained in popular accounts. Bones do not sit in the ground untouched for millennia. Groundwater moves through them. Dissolved carbonates come and go. Microbes rebuild the collagen that radiocarbon labs actually want to sample. If conservationists decades ago helpfully soaked a bone in modern glue to stop it from crumbling, they added fresh carbon to what is supposed to be an ancient sample, making it appear younger than it really is. Charcoal found near bones carries its own problems. Radiocarbon dates the atoms in the specific object you put in the machine, not the context around it. A piece of charcoal lying next to a large femur might be from a campfire, lit 1,000 years after that femur was buried. It might have washed down from a younger layer above. It might even be the root of a tree that burned in a recent wildfire and was pushed down by burrowing animals to rest beside a Pleistocene fossil, as if they had known each other forever. If you want to claim that a human, giant or otherwise, was alive 12,000 years ago, you need a date from the bone itself, or from something you can demonstrate archaeologically was deposited at the same time. That means careful excavation, three-dimensional recording of every find, attention to the color and texture and grain of the surrounding sediment, and willingness to sit with uncertainty rather than force association. Most of the dramatic late survival claims for unusual humans fail at exactly this point. The date and the bone are connected only by proximity in a poorly documented deposit, separated by decades of handling, and tied together by a story that someone found compelling. What makes the island giant question different from simple myth is the framework of evolutionary biology that says the scenario is possible, combined with physical specimens that have not yet been fully explained by the alternatives. Those alternatives deserve serious consideration. A tangled deposit of bones from different animals and time periods, mentally assembled into one creature by a brain that wants a story. Pathological gigantism acting on a single individual rather than a population. Bones warped and expanded by the chemistry of their burial environment, then reconstructed generously by people whose mental model of normal had already been shaped by the legend. A tall but otherwise fully modern human population, perhaps with a genetic founder effect from small initial settler groups, living at the upper end of the ordinary height range. Each of these is more parsimonious than a new species. Each deserves to be tested before the more radical explanation is entertained. Testing them requires something the early history of this question never provided: controlled excavation with proper stratigraphic documentation, direct radiocarbon dates from the bones themselves using modern pre-treatment protocols, morphological analysis against a wide comparative sample rather than a narrow reference population, and consistency across multiple individuals and multiple sites rather than the spotlight on one impressive specimen. When redating campaigns have been run on classic giant sites using improved methods, two things reliably happen. Many dramatic dates move. Charcoal reported as 12,000 years old turns out under more rigorous treatment to be 4,000 years old, a recent fire rather than an ice age hearth. And occasionally the reverse occurs. A specimen long assumed to be just another old bone yields clean collagen and a radiocarbon age that really does sit at the very end of the Pleistocene, supporting rather than undermining the late survival claim. The oral traditions associated with these islands cannot be dismissed, but they also cannot be treated as signed testimony from prehistory. Stories are not fossils. They move, they change, and they shed details that don't matter to the people carrying them while amplifying the parts that do. When multiple independent communities with no shared contact consistently describe large people associated with specific places, particular cave systems, specific coastal headlands, particular inland lakes, that convergence is worth something as a prospecting guide. It tells you where to look. It preserves in distorted form a memory that the ground in those places has given up things that were remarkable to the people who found them. What it cannot do is tell you how tall those things actually were, when they died, or whether they belong to a species distinct from our own. The complication is that once an island's giant stories become public knowledge, they begin to contaminate themselves. A travel blogger posts a piece. A tourism office puts giants on its brochure. Reporters arrive and ask leading questions. Kids grow up hearing tourists ask about giants more than they hear their grandparents' older, messier, less dramatic versions of the stories. Over a couple of decades, the tale smooths out and standardizes around what outside audiences already expect it to be. The genuine, deep time residue, consistent references to particular locations, specific animals, particular behaviors associated with these large people, gets buried under the noise of the modern myth. Extracting the pre-contact kernel from the post-contact accumulation requires careful ethnographic work, comparison with written records from early missionaries or colonial officials that clearly predate the modern giant craze, and attention to whether story elements appear only after the sensational wave, or whether they have roots in older accounts. The question of whether any of these island bones could represent a distinct human species rather than a tall population of our own sites at the edge of what current evidence can support. Paleoanthropology already has multiple examples of late surviving hominin relatives. Homo floresiensis, on Flores, surviving until roughly 50,000 years ago. Homo luzonensis in the Philippines. Late Neanderthals holding on in European refugia until around 40,000 years ago. And Denisovans, an entire branch of the human family, known primarily from genetic traces in living people, and a handful of physical specimens from a single Siberian cave. The basic fact that another human lineage could have survived in isolation long after modern humans became dominant elsewhere is not science fiction. It has already happened multiple times, and in at least one case, the evidence came not from bones, but from genomic analysis of living people who carry the genetic legacy of contact. But body size alone is a terrible basis for claiming a separate species. Modern Homo sapiens already spans nearly half a meter of average height difference between the shortest and tallest populations alive today. A well-fed, physically active group of island-dwelling people with a favorable genetic founder effect could plausibly reach average heights that would look remarkable against any mainland comparison sample without belonging to any lineage other than our own. For a separate species argument, you would need consistent anatomical differences stacking up across multiple individuals, skull shapes, dental patterns, limb proportions, joint surface morphology that fall outside known human variation and that persist across time and space in ways that rule out individual disease, dietary effects, and normal population variation. You would need secure dates, and ideally you would need ancient DNA. Though the warm, humid environments where many of these islands sit are among the worst possible for DNA preservation, meaning the absence of recoverable genetic material tells you nothing about what species left the bones. Even environmental DNA pulled from cave sediments, fragments shed from skin and waste and decaying tissue, sometimes recoverable from layers where no physical bones remain, comes with enough analytical traps to prevent any single result from being decisive. Sediments mix. Roots drag material between layers. Contamination from modern humans handling the samples can swamp ancient signals. What sediment DNA can do under rigorous conditions is add a line of evidence pointing in a direction, a ghost census of who was present that combines with the bones and the tools, and the food remains to build a coherent argument rather than support one. What would actually resolve this question is not one spectacular find. It is a program. Systematic survey of the island using LIDAR and ground-penetrating radar to map potential sites through dense vegetation and underwater, looking for cave systems, ancient terraces, old shorelines now lying underwater, controlled excavations at promising locations, working slowly in small measured units, screening all sediment, recording every find in 3 dimensions, maintaining detailed notes on stratigraphy so that the context of each bone is not an afterthought but the most important datum collected. Direct dating of any candidate giant specimens using multiple independent methods that converge on the same time window. Comparative morphological analysis published with full measurements and scan data so that other researchers can evaluate the claims rather than simply trust the conclusions. And ongoing collaboration with communities whose oral traditions may still carry geographic pointers to places not yet formally surveyed. The stakes of getting this right extend beyond the specific island. If a distinctive population of large-bodied humans really did survive there until the very end of the Pleistocene, then our timeline of who was alive when needs another entry, and our models of how small island populations can diverge under isolation need to account for a human case that went in the opposite direction from the Flores hobbits. If they did not, then understanding exactly why the bones and stories convinced so many people for so long tells us something equally important about how we read fragmentary evidence when it points at something we want to find. Either way, the island stops being a canvas for whoever shouts loudest and becomes what it actually is, a test of how carefully we can listen to the deep past with all our tools and still admit what we do not yet know. That admission is harder than it sounds. Our brains want clean answers. We want to know whether the giants were real, full stop. But science dealing with fragments of bone in damp limestone caves on shorelines that have been moving for 12,000 years rarely gives full stops. It gives probabilities, calibrated ranges, hypotheses that have survived attempts to kill them, rather than conclusions that have closed a question. The giants on this island sit in a liminal space, not fantasy, not confirmed fact, but a hypothesis with enough physical grounding that serious researchers return to it, and enough methodological gaps that serious researchers push back against it. Learning to sit with that tension without collapsing it into certainty in either direction is not comfortable. It is, however, how you stay honest about what the past can and cannot yet tell us. The evidence so far shows a consistent pattern: bones that fall at the upper edge of human size ranges, oral traditions that point to specific places with a convergent specificity that casual myth-making rarely produces, a biological framework that says gigantism under island conditions is not only possible but expected, given the right circumstances, and a dating picture that is suggestive but not yet airtight for the specific claim of survival at 12,000 years ago. That combination is enough to keep the question alive. It is not enough to answer it. What moves it forward is not another dramatic photograph or another retelling of a local legend, but the slow accumulation of carefully documented material from well-chosen sites, analyzed with methods designed to catch the biases of both the believers and the skeptics. When that accumulates, if it accumulates, the mystery will not disappear. It will either sharpen into history or dissolve into natural variation. Both of those outcomes are worth knowing.